And really what I wanted to do was kind of play back to you all what I'm hearing. So I'm really hearing two ends of a spectrum. So, you know, those of you who are in significant growth mode and wanting to be able to scale quickly but sensibly. Those of you who maybe are in a bit more of a consolidating mode, but you're still expecting some volatility to ride out. So again, this ability to remain flexible and agile and scalable is quite important. I'm picking up at the bigger end of town how to leverage the global model. And James, I love your global model, how to create a global model, which is tricky and not going to be super relevant for those who don't have an international framework to fit. But we can definitely look to that. And I think there is also this flavor of influencing, which perhaps comes through a little bit in what Lauren was talking about in terms of how do we analyze success, but potentially go further than that, which is to use that analysis to influence further success. So those are going to be the kind of the themes I'm going to focus on. I need to apologize up front. I've got, can I swear? Fucking hideous hay fever. So my mouth is full of cactus. So I'm going to need to drink a lot of water as we're talking. So forgive me. I'm not being kind of weird and Donald Trump-esque. I'm just hay fever. Right. So what do I want to talk to you about? So my background to help give me a bit of context, I suppose, in this conversation is before I worked at a number of recruitment agencies and ran some big headhunting businesses in Europe for a number of years before I moved over to Australia. When I started working with Bupa Australia. Now, Bupa is an international business, as you probably know, with a global local relationship to work through. So I have some exposure to that. And then I moved on to Australia Post, which doesn't have an international parent, and is certainly one of the larger ends of town in terms of operating model that we can talk to. So one of the first things that I think people go to when they think about, I'm going to ask you, what is the first word, one word, that you think of when somebody says, let's talk operating model? What do you think we're going to talk about? One word. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So when people talk about operating models, what they typically talk about is, or what they typically think of, are what I would call the formal side of an op model structure. So when you think of the formal side of an operating model, you think of structure, you think of process, you think of hard lines, linear processes, you know, things you can touch and feel. So the tangible, formal stuff, governance, KPIs, SLAs, etc., etc. These are your kind of formal frameworks. And there's about 4 to 8 of those that you would typically work through as you work through an operating model. And you can look those up. There's quite a number of them. They're kind of standard operating model principles, which the big 4 have all over Google, but I'm happy to share some of my favorites with you if you want that after the effect. The other side, however, that most people largely ignore, and that's where I do more than half of my work. I do a lot of that side of the work, but more than half of the work that I do is on the other side. And the other side is what I suppose colloquial language is soft stuff. So what I would call the informal structures that make an organization work. So that's really capability, relationships, interactivity, trust, clarity, etc. Now, the reason for sharing that with you is that structure without the trust and the clarity and the relationships is utterly pointless. And structure is what most organizations leap to as the silver bullet for what is frequently a problem on the other side of the balance sheet. It is frequently a relationship, behavior, trust, power play, etc., problem, not a structure problem. And structure does not fix culture and behavior. So I just want to put that out there, because a lot of people come to me going, we've got this problem and we want you to, you know, redesign us to solve the problem. You cannot structure your way out of a people problem. So the one thing I would say, if you're coming to the table with a kind of a problem statement in the back of your head that your organization has perhaps said, you know, we're a bit dysfunctional, things aren't working perfectly, we need to restructure ourselves to fix that, which is super common. 90% of the inquiries I get are that. Then the first thing you probably need to be asking yourself is it actually structure, or is it in fact how we get along with each other, how we work together, how we proactively communicate, and how we naturally collaborate? Because the one thing that we all know, and the one thing that's absolutely true, and after 20 years in this game, I can tell you is 100% true, is that no one has a perfect structure, no one. And we all have to work around the structure that we're working in right now. So I would challenge any of you to tell me that you don't have workarounds to your current structure, systems, and processes, because of course you do, and you'll never not be there. So job number one is to kind of set your mindset right, which is that there's no silver bullet, there's no perfect structure, process, or system. You're always going to have a workaround. So how you work together is the number one most crucial enabler of everything that you're about to talk about, because without that, it doesn't matter what you build, it still won't work. So that's my little mindset lesson over and done with. But please do remember that if you go away with nothing else, because there's a million structures out there, any one of which could suit you on any given day, and your structure will change as your organization changes, and it must. But the most important thing that you really should invest in is actually how your people get along, because if they can do that, they can work through anything, and they become more and more agnostic of structure, which is more and more the way that we're trying to drive organizations to become more nimble and agile, is to actually let go and shed some of these concepts of hierarchy and structure and hard lines. We actually want to bring ourselves to a position where people are showing more initiative, working more closely together, being more collaborative, trusting, picking up problems and solving them without being directed to. That's our workforce of the future. So really, structure and op model in many ways is not the right conversation to be having. There we go, I'm done, I'm out of here, mic drop. No, I'm kidding. All right, but where you have to have the conversation about op model, and of course you do, these are the things that I'd like to have a think about. So, all right, so question number one from me to you, one word that you think sums up what next year will bring. Yeah, so lots of change, opportunity, adaptation. Yeah. So there's no question in most of the economists' minds that the next 2 years will be a little bit more volatile than this year. So if you were hoping to never see a year like 2020 again, I'm really sorry, because that's news that sucks. We're going to see more volatility. We're going to, in Australia in particular, see the subsidies stripped away, and we'll have a look at what the true economic forecast looks like. And what that means is that we must continue to do business differently. We must actually continue to accelerate our ability to do business differently. We are going to knowingly next year walk into a couple of years of high volatility, which means our ability to be changeable and to react and respond is really, really important. I recently wrote a blog called Be the River, Not the Rock. And this is really aimed at kind of leadership mindset. And it really talks to the fact that sometimes we feel that we need to lock down structures and op models to become more certain for our people. It's coming from a really good place, but it's actually intrinsically the wrong thing to do, because the more that we try to stand still when we know that we're in a torrent of huge change, and this is, social revolution level change, people will be studying this era for hundreds of years to come. So for us to try and cling to structures of certainty, which is what we all naturally want to do, because that's what our brain requires, a house with a front door that you can lock, that's what we desire as human beings. So for us to let go of that concept is virtually impossible. But again, another mindset kind of straightener for everyone is we have to be the river. We have to be a constant, fluid, changeable creature if we are going to ride this torrent and not find ourselves smacked about by it. So trying to create things that are firmly in place is another mistake that a lot of my clients make, is they want to lock things down. You know, they want to do a 3-year plan, they want to do a 3-year structure, they want to hardline things, and actually they're thinking like a rock and not like a river. So another one is to make sure that you're thinking about some of your key principles. And those key principles really need to be based on what you think next year brings. And I say next year because the average restructure, and this was a stat as of 2018, was every 18 months. The average return on investment for a restructure is every 2.5 years. So if anyone's really, really good at maths, you'll notice a big difference between the frequency that you're restructuring and the time with which you're going to recoup your money. Effectively, organisations have been losing money on restructuring for the last several years, 5 or 6 years. The number of restructures has outstripped the value of the restructure. So that's another thing that's going to be really important for you to kind of test and agitate for, is, are we restructuring because we think it's a silver bullet? Are we restructuring because we want to be kind of consistent and solid? Are we restructuring because there's return on investment to be taken? Yes, James, the super tanker that never reaches port. Yeah, utterly pointless, right? Because these are the questions that actually your executives will really appreciate from you. They won't have answers for it, but it means that you're locking into the right principles. So the principles with which you commence a conversation around operating model are probably the most important conversations that you have. So it's a little bit like the axe sharpening analogy. I think it was Einstein who said, if somebody told me to, solve a problem and I had 1 hour, I'd spend 58 minutes thinking about the problem and 2 minutes solving it. The axe analogy is another one. If somebody asked me to chop down a tree, in an hour, I'd spend 50 minutes sharpening my axe and 10 minutes doing the chopping. So this is exactly the point of focusing on your principles before you move to the op model design work. Because what we see all the time is that not having really clear, really well tested and really well socialized principles are the #1 derailer of any operating model work that I've ever been involved in. And it really undermines your success. It also, unfortunately, undermines your reputation as a leader. So if it's easy for people to undermine your design, it's really because you as a leader didn't engage sufficiently with stakeholders to move them from nodding dog syndrome, yeah, we should do that, which translates as interesting but not interested, right? So to move them from this kind of nodding dog to buy-in, which is, yeah, I support you, off you go and do it. That sounds good, but it ain't good, because it means the risk and the work is still on you. That's buy-in. Stay in is, yeah, I support you. What can me and my team bring to the table? I want a piece of this. That's the conversation you actually want to get your stakeholders to. And typically what we do is we kind of accept nodding dog because we're like, oh, awesome. They've said yes, but actually they didn't really mean it. They just kind of went, yeah, interesting, not interested. You get them to buy in, which is the holy grail of all communications and change experts who say we need stakeholder buy-in. I would say buy-in is not enough, not today, because today's business landscape is so changeable that whatever was in their bucket of shit to be done, that allowed them to say, yes, I can prioritize your project, and yes, I will give you my buy-in, my permission to go forward, work around with my teams, collaboration, support, even maybe a bit of money. That list of criteria, their priorities, are so changeable right now that unfortunately that kind of surface layer agreement to work together on this problem is no longer enough. For you as a leader, you are exposing yourself to being, for them to change their mind, and ultimately for them to kind of leave you in the lurch, or for the level of support that you'd agreed on to not be available when you really, really need it. And what this does is to use the language, it hangs leaders out to dry. It does a little bit. So there's a lot of leadership at the moment that's feeling very vulnerable, very under threat, very exposed, very alone, because they're not stepping forward. It's just that other people are stepping back. And the people who are stepping back, it's not their fault, but priorities are changing so rapidly that they're constantly having to reprioritize. And if your project together, if your collaboration becomes a victim of that reprioritization, it's not their fault and there's very little they can do. So getting to stay in, the really big trick there is actually the exercise of making them find a criteria that means that your priority for them and your collective priority of this work will not change no matter what priorities shift. That's a pretty big one, but it means your order of magnitude for them has to be a kind of a sacred cow level. And you've got to find something that is so important to them that they won't let it go, even when they're right down to the wire and they're stripping out all sorts of other things. They'll hold yours to the last. How do you do that? The way that you do that is you really work to their agenda first. So typically something that makes their world, fascinatingly more productive, makes their world quicker, back down to the core basics, right? So cheaper, faster, better, and probably in the order of cheaper, faster, and better. Even if you're in huge growth mode, nobody right now has the confidence to just throw good money after bad. Everyone's going to want you to show that you can do things on a shoestring, because they just don't know where this turbulent next couple of years is going to land them. So they want to take huge advantage right now, but they want you to think like you're in a downturn just in case. So a really good way for you to play is to keep those really basic measures of success loud and proud, because this is a year where bringing it back to basics is going to actually make you communicate very cleanly. And it also means that people are less likely to deviate from their shared responsibility to delivering on the initiative that you're talking about or you're sponsoring. So getting it back to those basic measures means it becomes much, much harder for people to move away. When you're looking at kind of secondary measures or measures who have been more prevalent in the recent contemporary years, then unfortunately those are the ones that can be impacted by variance in market, which means that you're a prime target for being deprioritized. And you as a leader can't afford that. It's bad for your brand and it's a waste of your time. So everything you can do to stay up in that top quadrant of kind of untouchable sacred cow, it's a thing you should do. All right. So when we think about what we've said about next year, we've talked about change. We talked about flexibility. So one of the first things that we all know we need to build in is more adaptability. I really liked one of the comments that came out. I'm just having to think about who it was. I really like one of the comments that came out about moving away from a specialist HR model, which by its nature means that you've got lots of little parts, and moving towards a more generalist model. This is a really, really smart move. And one of the things I want to share with you now is, let me see if I can do a quick share screen. I'm not sure if you're seeing that. Hopefully, let's have a little look. Hold on.
Screen.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, here we go. Let's just see if this will work. Hopefully you can all see the HR operating model of the future here.
If you want to make it bigger, everyone, on the top right-hand corner are the arrows squeaking out. That's what you hit.
Awesome, thank you. So this is a short report by Gartner for HR, which came out only a couple of months ago. I'm very happy to share a copy with you. Just ping me a note on my email and I'll get a copy sent over to you. And it really talks to the big shift with where we've been, which has been a best practice house of HR practitioners. What we've moved through this year, which is a year where no one in HR has seen what we've had to deal with this year. So all of that great best practice kind of got thrown out the window and got replaced with brilliant problem solvers who can mobilize and communicate and collaborate really rapidly around never before seen things. So for those of you who do assessments in the course of your life, you'll know that we normally assess people for their verbal reasoning, their numeracy. My favorite has always been inductive, because inductive is your raw mental horsepower. How can you tackle problems that you haven't seen before and you can't have trained for? That's basically 2020 in a nutshell, right? So problems that we haven't seen before and we can't have trained for. So what they suggest is that we move from an organization that was a lot more siloed, looked at this best practice house, and we move to a problem-solving, rapid deployment model. So remember, we were talking about those key principles. That's why it's so important to link everything that you do and every principle you have in terms of design back to what you think the next couple of years will bring. You know, assume that you're going to restructure again in 2 years, because you will, if not before, and therefore say, well, within this period, what will the business need from us the most? So it could be, you know, radical fluidity. If you're a small business and you need to be hyper nimble, it could be that you need to leverage but choose to ignore when necessary the international frameworks so that Australia can remain nimble. Ultimately, agility is going to become really, really important. And this is really what Gartner is putting forward. What they are saying is there's a couple of big kind of replacements that we need to do. So one, the big replacement of the traditional HR business partner and turn them more into a strategic talent leader. So these are the people who own the people plans for their areas. They own the coaching and influencing of the senior leadership team, and they support some of the programs that get slotted through the business on an annual basis, so performance, succession planning, etc. But they really are quite senior strategic talent leaders. In the middle, what used to be, if you think about the Ulrich model, which was kind of business partnering, centers of excellence, and then some operations stuff, really what this model proposes is a destruction of that kind of stool approach and a much more integrated approach, which I really like. And it's actually, this is the model more or less I've been working on with one of my biggest clients all year. We take the centers of excellence away and we start to break them down into a more ubiquitous mass of problem solvers. We also bring some of those HR business partners out of the business, because if they're not just doing strategic work, coaching executives and influencing outcomes, then ultimately they need to move into the problem-solving mob or into the HR operations team, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The problem-solving mob then becomes a discipline-agnostic group of really smart people with massively great, you know, terrific collaboration skills, really good inductive problem-solving skills, the ability to see things from somebody else's perspective. So if you don't know whether you're one of those people, there's a really good video you should do that's a bit of a giggle. Have a look at Dan Pink, and there's a video that he does that kind of shows you whether the E exercise. So if you write an E on your forehead and it looks to the other person like their E, then you actually are very good at thinking about things from other people's perspectives. If you write an E on your forehead and it looks like an E from your perspective, then you're less inclined to think about other people's perspectives. And tragically, the more senior you become, the less inclined you are to think about other people's perspectives, which is why this problem-solving group shouldn't be made up of big-hitting, expensive executives. It actually should be quite a democratic group of bottom-up problem solvers. Then you keep a next generation of COEs, and this next generation of COEs is super lean. When I look at Australia Post, for example, 400 people in HR, you'd have almost 50% of those people in the centres of excellence, which is completely out of balance. So really what Gartner is saying is create this problem-solving group, and they can do any kind of problem solving. So you can put them against systems, numeracy, structure, coaching, leadership training, doesn't matter. Throw them at whatever the problem is, let them resolve it. The next gen COEs are super light. So you might just have one person with superhuman skills and knowledge in a particular domain of HR, or you might even outsource it. And I think, one of the things we have to think about when we're thinking about new operating models is not just structure, which is what we're talking about now. We really need to think about capability. And this model really shows you the shift from capability being a skill and an experience, what we know, which is the old school COE of experts and best practitioners, to what we can do, which is this new problem-solving piece, which is actually about your capability up there and got little to do with the experience that you've had or the training that you've done or the expertise that you bring. So a really material shift in terms of what we value from a capability perspective. And we're valuing experience much less and problem-solving capability much more. So I'm seeing quite a lot of my clients beginning to really look at the blend of their workforce to be able to allow them to be scalable and to, you know, to top up and slow down when the business needs to. So bearing in mind that volatility as a primary design principle. What they're doing is they're really putting together models like this where they're starting to outsource their COE. So if they've got a big restructure to be done, they'll get a small team in, do the restructure design, hand it over, or give it to the problem solvers to do. Or if they've got some leadership design work to be done, they might just outsource that one discrete piece of work if the problem solvers can't do it themselves. So rather than have someone sit on the bench whose expertise is to do leadership design, they're actually making sure that their people are always fully deployed, and they're really leveraging the concept of a hybrid community of practitioners. And I think that's going to be really important for us because, well, I think it's just going to be really important for us, right? So workforces want to be more flexible. People are seeking portfolio careers. Therefore, you're going to need to offer it anyway. And in fact, it's often cheaper to get a more expensive person in for a much shorter amount of time to have a bigger and better impact rather than hold somebody on the bench just in case. We all know this, we're in resourcing, but a lot of business leaders don't know this. So it's a conversation that we really need to have to show them the difference between the cost of running an on-bench team and the cost of running a hybridized team with more volatility baked in. The last bit of this exercise, and then I'm going to come back onto my screen because I don't seem to be able to mix and match very well. The last bit of this model is the HR operations and service delivery side of things. So in here, you're really talking about day-to-day interactions. So if you look at the right-hand side as being what you might, and I hate using this label, called kind of strategic HR, on the left-hand side, you're really looking at the day-to-day running of HR. Now, I think the next couple of years, operational excellence is no longer going to be a dirty word. And in fact, I'm going to champion it because I'm so over the word strategic. I believe that being strategic means that you can be strategic every day. So a truly great strategic leader is just as happy and is given just as much kudos living in HR operations as they are living in strategic talent. So this is the space that you start bringing together your day-to-day stuff. So a really easy way that I would say draw the line between the two. If you're getting daily phone calls on a particular topic, it belongs in HR operations. If people are touching a piece of technology on a daily basis, it belongs in HR operations. If somebody needs to make phone calls in to a particular place, it's an HR operations or shared services environment. And of course, because of that, that's who owns the data, because they're in the flow, in the traffic all day, every day. Their ability to bring up trending questions, trending behaviors, trending inquiries, and trending results is 1,000 times higher than an HR business partner's will ever be, because all they see is one thing. And in this model, very deliberately, they won't have any of that data at all. They're utterly dependent on the engine room of HR to provide the interactions, the experiences, and the insights that help them to do their jobs. So I might just flick over now to open up for a few questions because I figure I'm missing a few as I'm going. Let's see, Laura, how do you give the problem solvers a sense of job identity and career growth? Yep, good question. So we've come up with that recently with one of my bigger clients, and the answer that I've given them is, what would a management consultancy do? Which is working incredibly well for them. So when we think about a management consultancy, you know, really, they're not far off that model. So if you think about your true experts at a PwC or a KPMG, you'll have one or two real kind of best practitioner thought leaders, but not everyone. Everyone else is in the big box in the middle. So whether you're a consultant, a manager, or even a senior manager, whilst you might align to a particular domain, you're actually deployable against anything, any project. You just bring a certain flavor to the projects, but the projects that you work on can be really mixed and matched. Now, not so much if you're one of these next gen COE people. So if you're, you know, if you're the HR technology architect for a supersized business, well, then that's likely to be your job pretty much all the way through. But I think for Laura's question there, I would think about them in the same way that you would if you were a management consultancy practice. And that's exactly what they do. You know, they plan things that are very much circuitous. So they think about different industries, different scales of problem, different seniority of relationships. You know, they really look at career pathing not as a ladder, and there are plenty of career pathing models out there that still actually have a ladder in their basic architecture, and they're to be avoided. But they actually flip it. This is why Workday is becoming so popular, and I know not necessarily popular with recruiters, but very, very popular, is because their data model is reversed. So they don't think about things as pathways. They think about you, the human, as a nucleus. And what you need is to grab stuff and pop it in your backpack as you go through your career. And that just makes you bigger. And the bigger you get, the more impact you've got. So that's kind of the mindset they've got about the way that they use their data. And I think that's really how we need to be thinking about career pathing, is it's less about a journey and it's more about, you know, being a little nucleus that grows bigger through learning. And you can learn in any direction. You can be learning in multiple directions at the same time. So what I would say is start rethinking some of your really traditional career pathing frameworks and start thinking a little more about what is it that people need, because they could get multiple hits from different assignments. And that's really how the consulting practices operate. So let's have a look at James's one. How do you get the skills necessary into a COE seat with job satisfaction and career path? Well, what do I want to say about that? I'll be frank, because we're in a closed environment. I think the era of the COE is actually dying out very rapidly. And in fact, the desire to be the center of excellence we should be putting people off, because that's actually putting people into, you know, a little box. And in a world where everything's super volatile, you want the biggest box you can possibly be in, right? You want to be able to go anywhere, do anything, not be super niched down into something that could easily close off. I mean, look at talent acquisition this year. That's an example of chasing a COE career, being very proud of being a talent acquisition expert, and being quite isolationist in our talent acquisition expertise. And it nearly killed us. You know, it's hurt many people's careers. So I would say really kind of get people to rethink their desire to be a COE, because the era of the expert is waning. The era of the generalist problem solver has arrived. So in fact, that's a legacy career plan, and one that really should be challenged today. Most of the organizations that I work with, when you say COE, if you're talking to HR, they've got the legacy of, oh yes, when I grow up, that's what I'd really like to be. And when you talk to the business, they're like, the center of embarrassment. They are not into COEs at all. They have a really bad brand outside of HR, where they have a really amazing brand. So there's huge dissonance between what we think a COE is and what the business thinks it is. And you've always got to put your bet on the business. The business always wins. So I would be very firmly, in fact, I am very firmly saying I don't think COE careers are the thing to chase anymore. I think being an expert generalist, you know, really bloody good at anything that anyone throws at you, is absolutely the way to go. So start being a little bit more agnostic and a little bit more broad. One of the things that I've talked about in one of the masterclasses that I run, and again, I'm happy to send you a note on that, is how do you come out of your business? So, you know, we've talked about working in your business and working on your business. I would often sit there and go, I don't actually know what that bloody means. What it means is that for as long as you're in a silo, you're at risk. Your career is actually at risk. So if you're in a silo and a business changes in such a way that your silo is no longer required, TA is a great example, then everything in that silo gets shut down. And of course, if that's happening around the country, then it's really hard to find another silo to join. And that's been the experience of a number of TA people this year. So what I would say is you need to be doing everything you can, not just to protect your own career, but the careers of the people with you, to get across the T. So what is it that TA people are good at that they can apply agnostic of structure and function? So these are things like user experience, talent models, influencing managers, workforce planning. These are a number of things that actually belong traditionally in other parts of HR. The more of that stuff you're doing, the less at risk you are here. The more you kind of focus on your excellence in sourcing, your excellence in assessment, the more at risk you actually become. So I would be really, particularly as you are a group of managers and leaders, I would really be thinking hard about how do you make sure that you've got fingers in pies outside of your function, so that should your function get squeezed, you've got room to overflow into other areas. Because if your function gets squeezed, then you're not across that T, you've got nowhere to go, you just get squeezed. So Laura talks a lot about influence. Yes, influence and impact, and in fact, plug for book that's about to come out, is really called Impact, and it's really about why we as leaders have to stop worrying about the ladder and start worrying about how we operate. And the more impact you have, the more seat at the table you get, the broader you can influence outcomes, and actually the more and more secure you make your whole function, as well as yourself. So that's a really important point, Laura, is that impact or influence is miles more important than seniority. I can tell you a million times at Australia Post that people assume that I had a job, my official job title is 10 times more impressive than it actually was, because I was operating in a mode that was 10 times more impressive than my job title required. So these are the kind of the doing business differently mindsets that you really want to try and instill before you think about operating model. Operating mode, I think, is really, really important. So another one then to think about is another piece of intel which I thought was interesting that came out of Elmo just recently. My whole career, recruitment has been in the top 3 kind of problem statements of HR, not because it's a problem, but because it's the most critical. And often, the biggest risk and the thing that they're most concerned about, and therefore it has the highest priority. Now, I know there's a bit of an irony that it often doesn't get the highest priority budget, but that's down to individual leaders and their influencing skills. The thing that I find really, really interesting this year for the first time, and remember, I've been around since the Stone Age. Seriously, faxes, a long time ago. The reason that I think that's really important is that Elmo are coming out and saying it has dropped out of the top 5. And this is literally the first time that I've seen that happen in 20 years. So recruitment is no longer the biggest priority for HR. And again, that just supports my encouragement of you to step out of TA and get across that T, because I genuinely think recruitment won't be enough. So a lot of the leaders I've been working with across the course of this year have kind of shape changed. So they're now heads of talent acquisition and mobility, or heads of talent, period, or heads of talent and resourcing. So start thinking about, or talent and workforce planning. Start thinking about the additional things that you can add to your capability so that you're moving out of those very, very highly specialized centers of excellence and moving into the problem solver space, or moving across into the HR operations space, where again, a lot of people are able to expand their capability. So if you think about what high volume recruitment leaders are brilliant at, it's handling high volume inquiries, it's building a tech stack, designing a brilliant user experience, automating as much as possible that is appropriate, and delivering really, really good data and insights. Now, take the word recruitment out of that, and you could apply that to pretty much anything across the employee life cycle, which would elevate the careers of your recruiters astronomically. Even good old, just plain recruitment consultants will outweigh an HR administrator at that level because they're asked to do so much more. So in fact, moving into HR operations is a career accelerator for a lot of people who come out of the silo of TA. So again, don't look down your nose at it. I think operational excellence is going to be the hero of the next 2 years. So if I was going to make a strategic choice on which way my career would go, and I was talking to the me of 10 years ago, I'd be going into HR operations to own that ship. That would be how I would make my career kind of future-proof, because I'm then running a function that is all about driving down costs, increasing efficiency, giving the right advice first time to the business, which means they can move faster and make decisions more easily, and providing insights that means our investment and our activity is hyper-targeted and accurate every time. That would be the way that I would make sure that I was at the top of the table when it came to HR stuff, because that's where the real power is if you leverage it right. Thank you. See you, Matt. Okay. So Rebecca's talking about engagement and retention being big focuses. I think that's a beautiful example of kind of being much, much broader and starting to think of certain things that you might already do in your EVP, in your talent acquisition world that has broad application, like EVP. So EVP was the way that I pivoted from just talent acquisition, which was, the intention when I came to Australia Post, and started then to stretch the function out across onboarding, resourcing, careers, and people change and offboarding. So that was the whole job in the end. Was really off the basis of saying the EVP touches every touch point of the life cycle, and I don't just want to design an EVP, but I need to influence how people deliver on the EVP. And through influencing them, I ended up owning them. And that was a cycle that I used again and again over 6 years to effectively build out a function that was almost, it was more than 30% of Australia Post's HR team sat in that function. And it was really based on some strategic premises like that one and the ownership factor. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. I want to open up for questions because I'm very conscious of time. I know that we missed a big chunk at the beginning, for which I apologise. But Andrea, is there a way that we can take people off mute so they can ask questions?
Again, if you raise your hand, I'll make you a speaker and you turn on your mic and things to come onto the screen.
The magic happens.
The magic happens. I'm all about creating magic. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raising.
Okay.
So, Rebecca, if I think about my career, and I'm going to ask a question, and I'll turn my camera on as well. If I think about my career, I actually started in HR generalist and then moved into TA, which I enjoyed a hell of a lot more. And if I wasn't an old lady running events, the next step would be to almost go back to generalist again, or find something around internal talent or workforce planning and things. Do you think there's scope there for then us to run training and those sorts of things, or we need to find ways people can learn it? Because it's not workforce planning is not an on-the-job learning thing.
For us, so
yeah.
Workforce planning is a funny one to pick on. What I would say is that I think that leaders in talent acquisition have an opportunity to shape change themselves into, strategic workforce planning and resourcing. So whether that's temporary, permanent, internal or external, or even if you really want to go there, consulting. I've never managed to achieve that bit, but that's okay. Then I think if you're in the space of internal mobility, which a lot of us with larger businesses are, fill a job with an internal person or an external person, then I think you absolutely should be adding on the kind of the career pathing and competencies and some of the learning and development activities that support career and job seekers and job hunters. The minute that you start owning some of the learning and development activity that supports a job hunter, you've got a footprint in L&D. So you can start stretching out to L&D. So one of my coaching clients just recently took on an expanded role to own L&D kind of went into panic stations, but then realized they've been running L&D programs and, you know, graduate programs and all these classical OD functions for ages. They just hadn't necessarily had any formal training. So the formal training is there. You can do micro learning in all of these things, and you don't need to know everything. As a leader, you surround yourself by people who know shit. Your job is to decide shit and set visions for shit, right? So you have to kind of start this tipping point, this exercise of moving away from being the expert and being the leader, because the two jobs are not the same. And I think that shift into leadership is terrifying for people who have been experts for so long, because it means they literally have to let go of what got them here in order to grasp what will get them there. And there's that horrible moment of letting go of the side of the pool and thinking, well, this better work, you know. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
So I'm not seeing any hands up. So what I'm going to suggest we do is we turn the presentation off, and we've got people sitting on two tables.
Right.
So perhaps move between the two tables, Beck, and answer any questions. On your tables, why don't you share with the group, with the people you're sitting with, about what your plans are around your operating models and what you're trying to grapple with, and see if you can't sort of share some insights. And I saw Belinda and Laura were talking about how they seem to be working in very similar environments.